okay with your friend doing business with your enemy?
You asking me?
Yeah.
I can't go to the Max B party because you're my friend. Yeah.
Why?
Because you my fucking friend, nigga.
What?
Yeah. Talk about it. Because let me explain something to you. I'm a loyal nigga at the end of the day. Before music. Let me tell you something. Let me explain something.
Maino already knew what was coming the moment that subject resurfaced. He could feel it before anyone even opened their mouth. But he leaned into it anyway, because in his mind, there was nothing to be ashamed of. He had lived through that period. He remembered exactly what it felt like. And more than anything, he remembered the loyalty. That's why he kept bringing it back up. 7 or 8 women making the trip to see him while he was incarcerated wasn't something he took lightly. Those weren't just photographs. That was evidence of who actually showed up when things were at their worst. And to him, that meant everything. But the room wasn't reading it that way. The moment he brought up that rotation again, you could see the reaction forming before a single word was spoken. Jim Jones leaned back with that look, the one that says he already had a response locked and loaded, and the whole energy in the room shifted. What Maino saw as a point of pride, everyone else saw as an opening, not to tear him down completely, but definitely to put him on the spot. That's just how it goes when real ones are in the same room. Nobody lets anything slide without pressing it first. Maino tried to get ahead of it early. He started laying out the context before they could even fully jump in. He referenced the time, the circumstances, the environment. He made it clear these weren't random encounters. These were jail visits. No makeup, no styling, no filters, no production. Just real people making a real effort to show up. In his mind, that completely changed the criteria. You couldn't hold those images to the same standard as curated content today. It wasn't even the same world. But Jim Jones wasn't about to let that argument carry the room. He heard it, he just wasn't buying it. He kept it straightforward. I understand what you're saying, but that doesn't change what I'm looking at. And that's what made it land harder, because now it wasn't just jokes anymore. It was a direct collision of 2 different viewpoints. One person was speaking from emotion and memory. The other was speaking from what was sitting right in front of him. Then the teasing picked back up. Somebody brought the ponytail comment back into the conversation and the room fell apart again. That one detail kept circling back like it was the headline of the whole story. And that's when you could tell Maino was genuinely getting irritated. You could hear it in how he responded. He was still attempting to laugh it off, but the tone had shifted. It wasn't lighthearted anymore. It was defense mode. Fabulous and Dave East stayed right in the middle the entire time. They weren't leading the charge, but they weren't pulling anyone back either. A laugh here, a comment there, just enough to keep the moment going without fully committing to a side. And sometimes that's actually what makes it worse, because it starts to feel like everyone is in agreement without anyone saying it directly. Maino kept returning to the same argument because that was the foundation he was standing on. He kept saying he was loved. That's what mattered to him. Not how the photos look years later, not how people judge them now, just the fact that those women showed up. He was trying to redirect the conversation from appearance to loyalty, but the room wasn't following him there. They kept pulling it back to what they could actually see. Jim Jones doubled down at that point. He tried to soften it slightly by saying not to take it personally, but he didn't move off his position at all. He stood on it just as firmly as Maino was standing on his, and that's what gave the moment weight instead of making it feel like pure entertainment. Nobody was backing down. Nobody was trying to smooth it over completely. Then, without anyone planning it, the conversation drifted into something bigger, the gap between eras, what people considered attractive then versus how those standards are measured now. Maino kept making the case that people today are conditioned to enhancements, filters, and a completely different standard of presentation. His point was simple. You can't hold unfiltered everyday moments from a different era up against the polished, curated content that dominates everything now. It's not a fair comparison. But even with that laid out clearly, the room still wasn't fully convinced. Then somebody hit him with that line again. Maybe it worked back then, just not in those particular pictures. And that set the whole thing off again, because now it felt like no matter what he said, they were going to keep circling back to the same conclusion. At that point, Maino had 2 options: laugh it off completely or stand firm. He chose to stand firm. He stopped trying to win them over and just held his position. He was loved. That was enough. That was his victory in that moment, and he wasn't going to let the jokes take that from him. The room stayed loud, the jokes kept coming, but there was a current underneath it all that never really went away. It just ran quietly while everyone kept talking over it. And that's what made this separate from just a regular funny moment. It had depth to it. On the surface, it was humor, but underneath, it was pride, memory, and more than a little ego on all sides. By the time it was winding down, nothing had actually been resolved. Maino didn't shift his position, Jim Jones didn't shift his. Fabulous and Dave East kept reacting just enough to sustain the energy without ever trying to bring it to a conclusion. And honestly, that's exactly what made it memorable. It felt real because it didn't wrap up cleanly. Maino walked away from that conversation the same way he entered it, standing on what he said from jump. Those pictures meant something. They represented a period when people showed up for him when it actually counted, and no amount of joking was going to rewrite that in his mind. At the same time, Jim Jones and the rest of the crew kept it honest in their own way. They weren't trying to dismantle him, but they also weren't going to perform a reaction they didn't feel. That balance between blunt honesty and humor is what kept the conversation moving, and it's why the clip resonated the way it did. It wasn't just entertaining, it touched something people recognized on both sides. Some viewers understood Maino's argument about loyalty and context. Others sided with Jim Jones for calling it exactly as he saw it. Two completely different readings of the same moment, and both felt valid depending on your perspective. By that stage, Maino could sense that nothing he said was going to redirect the room, but it stopped being about changing their minds. It became about protecting the meaning behind that memory, because to everyone else, it was just an old photo set that hadn't aged well, but to him, it was a timestamp, a reminder of who was there when it mattered most.
He started leaning harder into that angle, almost like he was speaking past the jokes now. He went deeper into how different that era actually felt, not just how it looked. He talked about how social media didn't control perception the same way back then. People weren't packaging themselves for public consumption around the clock. What you saw was genuine. And in the specific context of jail visits, it was even more stripped down than that. Nobody walked through those doors trying to impress anyone. They came because they cared. That was his entire argument. But the more seriously he spoke, the more the room tried to keep it loose, which made it feel like they were skating past what he was actually saying. Jim Jones dropped another comment, half joking, half genuine, essentially suggesting Maino was rewriting the story a little. And that one landed differently, because from Maino's side, he wasn't rewriting anything. He was recalling it exactly as it happened. That's when his tone changed again. Not louder, not heated, just more direct. He stopped laughing for a moment and spoke plainly. He said people always make the mistake of judging past moments through a present-day lens, and every time they do, the context disappears. And once the context is gone, the meaning gets distorted. That's what he was pushing back against. Fabulous reacted with a quiet laugh, the kind that says he understood both sides but had no intention of stepping into the middle of it. Dave East gave a slight nod and stayed right where he was. They let it breathe naturally, which made the whole exchange feel unguarded. Nobody was playing to the camera. Then it looped back around again, the way it kept doing to the photos themselves. Somebody joked that Maino should have just kept those memories private instead of posting it. And that line actually landed with a different weight, because for just a second, even Maino paused. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that he understood why someone would say it. He answered it straight, though. He said he posted it because he was proud. He wasn't thinking about how people would dissect it years down the line. He was thinking about what it stood for: loyalty, consistency, people who didn't disappear when things got hard. That was worth putting out in his mind. And that's when you could feel the slightest shift in the room. Not a full reversal, but something softened. The jokes didn't stop entirely, but they slowed. The edge came off. It felt less like reacting and more like actually listening. Jim Jones leaned forward and gave him a small nod, the kind that communicates respect for the stance even without agreement. He still slipped in one more light jab just to stay true to himself, but it didn't carry the same bite as before. It wasn't about dismantling the argument anymore. It was just part of the rhythm between them. Maino caught that shift. You could see him ease up slightly, not because he had won, but because he had been heard. And sometimes that's the only thing that actually matters. He wasn't trying to convince anyone that the pictures were flawless. He was making the case that they meant something. And once that point landed, he didn't need to keep pushing it. The conversation started drifting after that. There were still callbacks, still the occasional jab, but the core tension had run its course. It settled back into a regular podcast rhythm. Yet that particular moment hung in the air a little longer than everything else around it. And that's exactly why it connected with people outside that room. Because at its core, it was never really about the pictures. It was about how people assign value to things depending on where they're standing. Some people look at the surface and judge what they can see. Others look past the surface and judge what something represents. Maino stood on meaning. Jim Jones stood on what was visible. And neither one of them was entirely wrong. That's what made it compelling. That's what kept people talking about it. Even after the laughter faded, those underlying questions lingered. How much does context actually matter? Does loyalty carry more weight than appearance? And is it even fair to hold two completely different eras to the same standard? Maino left that conversation the same way he entered it, grounded in his own truth, not chasing consensus, just making sure his perspective was heard. And in a room packed with strong personalities, that alone carried weight. Because if it's all said and done, it wasn't about winning the argument. It was about not letting other people reframe your own experience for you. Even as the conversation tried to move forward, you could tell Maino's mind hadn't fully let it go. Because once something like that gets cracked open in a room like that, it doesn't just vanish, it lingers. The jokes that followed still had little callbacks folded into them, small side comments that kept pulling it back into view. He started speaking more calmly at that point, not trying to prove anything anymore, just explaining how he processes things. He made the point that people forget what it actually means to have real support when you're at your lowest. It's easy to laugh at old pictures. It's easy to critique how someone looked, but it's a completely different experience when you're the one sitting in a cell and people are giving up their time to come see you in person. That's not performative. That's not done for attention. That's a genuine effort. And that part of what he said didn't get a loud reaction, but it landed in a quieter, more settled way. Even Jim Jones didn't immediately respond. He just sat with it for a second, then gave a slow shake of his head, not fully convinced, but clearly absorbing the weight behind it. And sometimes in those kinds of conversations, that's the closest thing to agreement you're going to get. Fabulous finally added his voice, not to take a side, but to bring in some wider perspective. He noted how social media completely rewired the way moments are experienced. Back then, things stayed where they happened. Now, everything gets excavated, replayed, and judged by people who had no connection to the moment in the first place. And that's essentially what happened to Maino. Something that held one meaning at the time became something else entirely once the internet got a hold of it. Dave East chimed in briefly as well, agreeing that timing reshapes perception. He kept it short, but it was enough to start pulling the energy away from straight roasting and into something more reflective. Not heavy, but no longer just jokes either.
Maino nodded at that, because that was the first moment in the whole conversation where it felt like someone was actually meeting him in the middle. He didn't need full agreement, just acknowledgement that there was more beneath the surface than what everyone had been laughing at. And once he felt that, he didn't need to press as hard anymore. Jim Jones came back in, but with a slightly different tone this time. Still honest, still himself, but more measured. He basically said, I hear you, but you also have to understand how it's going to read once you put it out there. And that was probably the most grounded middle ground anyone reached during the entire exchange, because that's really what the whole thing boiled down to. Intent versus perception. Maino's intent was to show loyalty. The perception that followed turned into something else. And once something hits the internet, you lose control of how it's received. That's just the reality of it. Maino accepted that part, but he made it clear he didn't regret it. He said even if people joke, even if they can't see it the way he does, he stands by posting it because it represented something genuine, and he'd rather hold on to something real than reshape it just to fit how people think today. After that, the conversation finally moved on for good. The energy loosened back up. The jokes returned to their normal rhythm, and the moment gradually dissolved into the rest of the episode. But it didn't disappear. It just settled. Because anyone watching could see it was never just a funny clip. It was one of those unscripted moments where personality, pride, and perspective all collided at once. Nobody set it up. Nobody planned it. It unfolded exactly the way real conversations do. And that's why it stayed with people.
Not because of the ponytail jokes or the carousel comments, but because underneath all of that was something genuine. A conversation about how people measure things differently, how time distorts perception, and how effortless it is to laugh at something when you're not the one who lived through it. Maino didn't walk away embarrassed. He walked away understood, at least enough. Jim Jones never backed off his position, and he didn't have to. Fabulous and Dave East played their roles exactly right, keeping the balance without forcing a resolution that wasn't there. In the end, it wasn't about who was right. It was about showing how two completely different viewpoints can exist in the same space without one canceling the other out. One rooted in memory and meaning, the other rooted in what's right in front of you. And once that clip reached the internet, it took on a life well beyond that room. People chose sides, made memes, defended Maino, agreed with Jim Jones, and kept the conversation going long after the episode ended. But if you strip it all the way back, it's actually pretty simple. Maino wasn't posting pictures, he was posting a chapter of his life that meant something to him, and no amount of jokes was ever going to change what that chapter represented. And whether people laughed or not, that meaning stayed exactly where it was. By the time the conversation fully settled, Maino wasn't actively defending it anymore. He had already said everything he needed to say. At that point, it stopped being about changing anyone's mind and became about standing on his own memory of it. That's typically how those moments resolve in a group like that. Nobody fully agrees, but everyone moves forward once the energy exhausts itself. Jim Jones still had that smirk like he wasn't quite ready to let it die completely, but even he eased off. The jokes gradually shifted away from the carousel and back into regular podcast energy, but thus pushing it any further would have crossed from roasting into overkill. And in that room, everyone understood where that line was, even if they had been walking it the entire time. Maino eventually re-engaged with the broader conversation, like he had mentally filed that chapter away for now. But you could still sense it stayed with him slightly. Not in a heavy way, just in that quiet way where you replay how something sounded once the noise clears. That's what happens when something personal gets turned into entertainment in real time. Once the room quiets down, you feel it a little differently. Fabulous was the first to actually redirect the energy, steering things back toward lighter territory without making it obvious that's what he was doing. Dave East followed his lead, dropping small comments to keep the rhythm moving so the conversation didn't stay anchored to that one moment. And that's how the balance came back, naturally, without anyone forcing it. But outside that room, the audience wasn't ready to move on that quickly. The clip had already taken on its own momentum. People weren't just debating the photos anymore. They were debating the bigger idea underneath all of it: loyalty versus perception, real-life experience versus social media judgment, the standards of one era measured against the expectations of another. Maino's perspective started gaining more traction the more people actually sat with it. A lot of viewers connected to the idea of being judged for something that held a much deeper meaning at the time it happened. They understood what he was saying about people showing up when you're at your absolute lowest. That part resonated more than any of the jokes did. At the same time, Jim Jones's angle had its own backing. People were saying that once you put something out publicly, it stops belonging only to you. It stops being just your memory and becomes everyone's interpretation. And that's where the real tension lived. Not in the room, but in that gap between private meaning and public consumption. What made the moment stick wasn't the roasting itself. It was the fact that both sides had a legitimate point, and neither one was willing to fold. Maino wasn't going to minimize what that support meant to him during one of the hardest periods of his life, and Jim Jones wasn't going to pretend the visuals didn't invite the exact kind of commentary they received. That unresolved tension is what made it replayable. That's what carried it far beyond the podcast. In a broader sense, it became a reflection of how differently people can assign value to the exact same moment. One person sees loyalty, another sees appearance. One sees the context, another sees only the content. By the time it was all said and done, nothing about Maino's position had shifted. He still viewed those visits as genuine love. He still saw that photo set as a snapshot of a time when people showed up for him with no agenda and nothing to gain. And even as the internet transformed it into a running joke, that core meaning never moved for him. Jim Jones stayed true to himself as well, still direct, still honest, still laughing about it the way close friends do when they're keeping it real rather than trying to cause harm.
And that's ultimately what kept the whole thing from spilling into genuine conflict. It started as a memory, became material for jokes, brushed up against something more serious, and ended as a perspective gap that nobody closed, but that everyone understood a little more clearly by the time it was over.